I'm Shannan Bowen, and I am really excited to bring this topic to the stage at KMF today. It's an important one. Before we dive in, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. So, I lead the North Carolina Local News Workshop. I've been leading this organization since 2020. We're a support organization for news and information leaders across our great state of North Carolina. And we're also announcing next week, hopefully, that we are evolving our organization into something called NC Local. It's a new initiative that, thank you, that will provide more local reporting and news products across our state through a hub model that we actually tested out in Western North Carolina in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. So more on that to come. But today I have the privilege of bringing to stage some people who are really key in delivering critical information during one of the worst disasters our state has seen. Before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit about the purpose of today's session. And these are my only scripted remarks. This is going to be a conversation. We wanted to bring to light the lessons that we've all learned from Hurricane Helene and covering a disaster like this. And these insights, we hope, are relevant to journalists, to funders, to civic leaders, and technologists. We all have a role to play when a disaster is in our area. And we're going to share openly about these experiences. It might be a hard conversation from time to time. The people on stage here have gone through a disaster in their area and have played a critical role in informing people. And it's tough. And it might be tough to talk about today, so if we get to a point where our panelists need some time to process, we may just hold space for a minute and let that happen. I also want to say that we know that the session is specifically about Hurricane Helene and what we've learned from that disaster in North Carolina. But there have been disasters lately in California and Kentucky and other parts of Appalachia. And if you're somebody who has experienced that and would like to share during the time that we have for discussion, we invite you to do so and welcome your experiences as well. So today, we're going to hear from Laura Lee, News Director of Blue Ridge Public Radio, Micah Spain, Executive Director of Appalachia Relief, Patricia Serrano, reporter for Enlace, Latino, NC. And also, it's important to us that Patricia can share her experiences and express herself in her language to describe the experiences and needs of people from our mountain region's Latino communities. So we will also have a translator, Tamara, who will translate Patricia's input into English. All good. All right, so let's start actually with Patricia. Okay. Patricia, you were there in Asheville when Hurricane Helene came to the area. And by the way, I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, on the coast, where we typically experience hurricanes. And can you tell us just what it was like to experience this in the mountain region of the state, and what it was like when infrastructure failed? And also tell us some about your role at Enlace Latino and how you serve that region of our state.
Sí, muchas gracias, Shannan. Bueno, primero, soy Patricia Serrano, como ya me presentaron, y soy periodista argentina viviendo en Nashville, Carolina del Norte, donde todo esto sucedió. Y para contar un poquito cómo fue para mí vivir este desastre y cómo era en ese momento lo que estaba pasando, creo que es importante destacar que nunca había vivido algo así. Creo que gran parte de la población de Western North Carolina tampoco. Y como reportera y como periodista, el gran desafío para quienes trabajamos de esto era y es reportar algo que está pasando en tu comunidad y te está pasando a vos y le está pasando a tu familia.
So thank you first, Shannan. I am Patricia Serrano, as I have been already introduced. I am an Argentine journalist. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. And of course, it was very important for me to share what happened throughout this disaster. And it's important to highlight that it was a first time for me. And I think that for most of the population of Western North Carolina, as journalists and reporters, for us, it was one of the main challenges to report what was happening in the area where we were living.
Y sobre Enlace Latino, NC, que es el medio para aquel trabajo, quiero agregar que somos un medio sin fines de lucro que sirve a la comunidad latina en Carolina del Norte. Y en Carolina del Norte viven más de 1 millón de latinos y en Western North Carolina casi 60.000 latinos. Y por qué estoy hablando en este panel en español tiene que ver también el porqué de nuestro medio. Nosotros hacemos periodismo en español y creemos y luchamos por la justicia del lenguaje y el acceso al lenguaje, y en una situación tan compleja como un huracán, con todo lo que estábamos viviendo, poder llevar periodismo e información en español a la comunidad latina era fundamental, y era no solo fundamental, sino creo que es un derecho humano poder recibir la información en tu lenguaje materno, y en un momento tan complejo y de tanto estrés, las personas necesitaban obtener esa información en el lenguaje que podían entender. Hablaran o no hablaran inglés, hablemos o no hablemos inglés, el hecho de acceder a la información y a lo que necesitas en un momento de estrés en tu propio idioma, creo que hace parte de la justicia del lenguaje, así que agradezco también a Knight Foundation por permitir tener una intérprete hoy acá.
In Enlace Latino, or NC, my media outlet, I want to mention that we are a non-for-profit organization serving the Latino community in our region. I want to also mention that in North Carolina there are about 1 million Latinos in the population, but that in Western North Carolina there are about 60,000. And I thought it was very important in a situation of crisis and the complexity of a hurricane to be able to take into account the importance of language justice and language access. In those situations, it is very important to allow the population to receive information in the language that they can understand, regardless of them speaking or not the English language.
Y para completar mi respuesta sobre cómo fueron esos primeros días y ponernos un poco de nuevo en este momento tan traumático para todos, bueno, la noche del huracán fue la peor noche de mi vida, con muchísimo miedo y muchísimo susto y sin saber qué estaba pasando afuera, y al otro día despertarnos no, porque no dormí, así que yo vivo justo arriba del río, del French Broad River, entonces la mañana en que salí después de que el huracán se había calmado, fue ver mi pueblo, mi barrio desaparecer, porque River Art District es lo que yo puedo mirar desde mi casa y es el barrio al que siempre voy, es mi barrio, era completamente bajo agua. O sea, desde ese primer shock de saber que lo que estaba pasando era muchísimo más de lo que nos habíamos imaginado, a estar 2 días incomunicada con mi equipo de periodistas, porque soy la única que está en la región. Mi equipo después está en Raleigh y en Charlotte. Fue casi volver a un sistema de comunicación antiguo y empezar desde cero a ver cómo era que íbamos a poder llevar esta información hacia afuera y también llevar la información a la comunidad y al resto del estado y a lo que estaba pasando alrededor, al país, al mundo, a lo que fuera, decir esto está pasando y cómo hacemos, porque no teníamos los medios. Sin celular, sin agua, sin luz, sin gas, sin gasolina para poder llegar a lugares, y a la vez diciendo tengo que salir y tengo que contar esta historia y tengo que contársela en español a las personas que necesitan escucharla, que necesitan saber dónde ir a buscar agua, dónde acceder a comida, y estábamos hablando de eso, pero a la vez hablando de que todavía en esos primeros momentos y durante mucho tiempo todavía estábamos en una situación de buscando sobrevivientes. Así que la situación era un montón.
I also want to add that I didn't mention before, the interpreter here speaking, that she wanted to thank the Knight Foundation for allowing her to have an interpreter here. And going back to the answer about the first days, well, the hurricane night was the worst night of my life. We, of course, were in great fear. I won't say that I woke up the next day because it was a completely sleepless night. I live in front of the river in the River Art district. And after the hurricane passed, I could see the neighborhood where I live in completely disappear. It was underwater. Everything that happened was beyond our imagination. For 2 days, I could not contact my team, my work team. Most of them are in either Raleigh or Charlotte. So for us, it was starting from scratch. We had some information that we needed to somehow convey to the community, to the rest of the country, the state, and of course, it was very difficult. We had to resort to old-fashioned means. We had no phones, cell phones, no light, no gas to move around. And we had to tell this story not only in English, but also in Spanish for the Latino community. And for the first days, we were also, of course, looking for survivors.
Yeah. Thanks. Laura. So Laura's the news director of Blue Ridge Public Radio. I visited Laura a few months after the hurricane, and in the newsroom, there's this bulletin board where you had pinned up all of these different letters that people had sent you that literally thanked you for being, you in your newsroom, for being a lifeline during the storm. It was, people were thanking them for providing information about basic necessities that without Blue Ridge Public Radio, they would not have found where to find shelter, where to find water, where to find housing. Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you and just tell us what it was like serving as that lifeline for the community.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, and thank you to the Knight Foundation for having us here to talk about this. Yeah, so public radio, I've said this a couple times before, but public radio, people love their driveway moment, right? Their like quirky little weird story that you didn't know that you wanted to know something. And so public radio reporters generally are narrative storytellers. And we had to do a very intentional pivot, and I said this to the team early days, where we're just gonna be conduits of information. And so there will be time for narrative storytelling later, but right now it's just getting this information out. And then we started to, as a little bit of communication came back, and we were really fortunate because we had power. We were on generator for a little bit. We had power pretty quickly, and we had internet pretty quickly because we were in close proximity to the emergency center downtown. So we became sort of an open newsroom space for other journalists. Patricia was there with us from all over to use those offices. But we started hearing from people, no power, no water. The water really is you think about a disaster scenario, you think about, okay, your power goes out. We kind of all expected the power to go out. We did not expect 53 days with no water. I will never flush a toilet again and not think about that. And no internet, no cell service. I mean, really, people throw this word around, but it felt apocalyptic. Driving back to my dark house from the dark office, really, in the neighborhoods, as you said, didn't look anything like what they had looked like before. But we heard from people that, I'm on the side of a mountain, I don't have any power, I don't have any water. I dug a radio out of my basement and found some batteries and put it in there, and you were the only voices that we heard for days. And thinking about, that pivot to resources, to literally reading out, these are the addresses of where you can go get water. You can fill your water bottles. This is where you can go get oxygen if you have family members that are on oxygen. And a real sense of wanting to make sure that information was vetted because of the gasoline issue. It wasn't that we had a gas shortage, it was the accessibility of the gas. Not wanting to send people out, and to tell them, hey, you can get water here if we weren't very sure there was gonna be water there. Sending reporters out to places where we had been told there were gonna be things and finding out that there were not. So it really was a very different kind of, I think sort of in the hierarchy of journalism, sometimes we're like, oh, the news you can use, we kind of dismiss that. This is where it became vital.
Speaking of vital information, Micah. So newsrooms of all types in Western North Carolina were covering this storm across a variety of formats. And there were other grassroots efforts being developed at the time by people who are not traditional journalists, but are performing the core role of journalism, which is getting verified information out to people in ways that people need it and need to engage with it. Micah, tell us some about your story in AppalachiaRelief.org and how critical that was in reaching people.
Thank you. So I live in a bus, and Helene, I didn't have service or power the first few days, and then got it, so it wasn't as bad as so many people that I ended up helping. I saw information flying all over the place, and I was like, nobody has service and power. They're not going to be able to access this information on Facebook. Why? Someone needs to do something about it. And so I didn't sleep for 4 days and compiled all the information into a Google Doc and called it the emergency pigeon doc because, when you lose vital communication access, so it was pigeons used to be used to communicate, and I leveraged my Burning Man leadership network because I'm a board of director of a North Florida Burning Man regional called Florida and Fuego, and I just know a lot of burner leaders all over the United States and over the world too. And so that document went viral, and so I was having families drive 3 hours to get service to get on the phone with me, and I was using maps, using the resources that I was compiling and vetting and sharing, and I was going through layers of multiple people helping vet, and so we were all, it was all over all the place all at the same time. It was very overwhelming, and just directing individuals to the supplies that they needed that was life-saving, because you can't live without water, you can't live without food, and so after that, oddly enough, the program coordinator of Burners Without Borders reached out to me, not even friends with me on Facebook. She just knew what I was doing and heard about it, and she was like, hey, you should get in touch with these folks. And so Appalachia Relief used to be called Asheville Relief, and then we realized that because we were covering more than just Asheville, and we also wanted to represent the fact that we saw supplies, there were discrepancies. There were disenfranchised communities that had no supplies at all, like what you were kind of talking about with lack of getting to oxygen for people who are there's aspects of disabilities and older areas that they had nothing. There were people that were leaving their areas and then getting information and coming back and sharing that with their communities, neighborhoods like that. And so when we saw that, we were like, no, something needs to be done about it. So my document got merged with AR, and the foundation of that kind of strengthened what was being shared. So I think the first week was 67,000 users of the website, and it was all really fast, you know what I mean? And but it needed to be fast. So the website is based on from the perspective of the victims. People were driving 3 or 4 hours outside of their areas, coming back and sharing that with their community, and we wanted to go about it in the way that was lo-fi, text-based, downloadable, and then we also did PSAs. So when there was especially water, the boil notice and things like that, when they turned the water back on, there were still problems with the water, and that was unsafe for everyone. And so we did PSAs to even though the government was hey, yes, water's back on. People just listened and just started drinking it, and that can get you sick. You know what I mean? That's a danger. And so the PSAs helped kind of guide people and remind people that you have to go about things in a way, especially if your house is built after or before a certain time, your pipes are not as good. And when water is not constantly being used, there's all these different things like that. There's so many different facets and complexities there. And so PSAs were really vital in that aspect because they were printable, and because people didn't have access to technology in that aspect of communication. So old school flyers being put up in the different communities. And then also I was leading a big project with the emergency housing aspects, and the earlier numbers was over 27,000 families. This is just based off of the networks that we were collaborating with the different organizations and different grassroots and things like that, FEMA and Red Cross and et cetera. We were compiling information and data in such a way to be able to get that information out because we wanted to understand just how vast this really was. And so it was over 27,000 families without homes. And so we worked together to get donations and supplies and get those out to folks as well. So in a little over 2 weeks, AR and all of the organizations that AR got to work with and collaborate with, we were able to get over 20,000 homes out, like in just a little over 2 weeks. It was such an insane feat that like we did, you know, and just like, because when we were in the space of having the conversation, it was like, how are we gonna get help to do what we're doing in a sustainable way? And like I literally like heard the senator in that call tell us that we weren't gonna have funding from the state level or the federal level for this disaster, and like there's still discrepancies in that. So like people are doing this like myself without being paid in a non-sustainable way, but we're doing it because like it's saving lives, and that's such a huge thing, you know what I mean? It's like it's a human first thing. Everything's set aside, what you believe in, politics, all of it's set aside. We're just helping people live and survive because that's what's needed.
If there is ever a clearer example of the power of local news and the role that local news and information plays, it's this. It's literally saving lives, as Micah says. Each of you have talked about your experiences covering and providing information that's literally saving lives. But as we've talked together, you've each shared some of your personal experiences, the personal experiences of your teams. And I know that today you all wanted to bring some of that information to let people know, because that's a lot of lessons that we've learned and that you all have learned in covering this, and that like we're human. Your reporters are human. They're navigating their own emotions and experiences covering this. And sometimes as journalists, we don't stop and take time for that. And I think that's something that, Laura, I'd like you to start off talking about.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think it's part of our culture as journalists, right, to not talk about it. We're tough. We're just doing our jobs. We called ourselves a little feral squad. I don't know how endearing that really was, but we were pretty feral because no water means no showers as well. But, you know, we have a small team, 8 people, and the number of hours and the things that some of these very new reporters were having to experience at those early days was tremendous. And so we tried, and this is one of the things that I hope people here can appreciate and understand, and hopefully like work to build. You know, some of this we were just doing from kind of starting from zero, and I feel really strongly that it doesn't need to be that way. That we could have some infrastructure established, so when a small team experiences a disaster like this, which unfortunately we're going to continue to see, you're not reinventing the wheel every time. So some of the little details in terms of just day to day is that we had a morning meeting and an evening meeting, and I said, you know, I want you to identify one self-care thing you're going to do. Now that sounds like bubble bath kind of thing. No, I mean, sometimes the self-care was I laid on the floor and cried for 10 minutes, right? And then in the evening meeting, I would say, what did you do? What was if you want to share, what was your self-care today? I took a walk around the block, whatever. You know, we had air mattresses, people sleeping at the station. Don't tell the fire department, we were not supposed to be doing that. So it really was like a 24/7 operation, and that takes a toll. And I think the thing that I've realized of late is it doesn't just take a toll in that immediate, it takes a toll in the longer term. And we still have tons of work to do, right? Like there's still so much in the recovery efforts that we need to cover and information we need to get out. And it's the same little feral squad that experienced all of that that's doing it. So I think, you know, in attention to the human need, and some of that is very basic. One of the first, so I was not there when the storm hit. Of course, I was on vacation and had to come back. One of the very first things I had to do was put on gloves and clean out the toilet, because there was nowhere for the reporters to go to the restroom. They were using the restroom outside in downtown Asheville. So you really think about hierarchy of needs, you know, these things, not anything I thought I was going to do as a news director, bringing a bunch of food from, like I went to grocery, bringing tons of water in, serving the really basic needs of your people before you can get into any of the deeper work, to give them the opportunity to try to sustain in circumstances that none of us had ever experienced before. So it really taught me, yeah, it's people first, it's human first, like you were saying, both for our staff, but also for the community. You know, going out and having hard conversations with a family that, you know, lives in the neighborhood with 11 people from the same family that died in a landslide. This gentleman was in his 80s. You know, these are his neighbors for decades, and they're gone. Like, it's completely wiped out. You know, the reporters having those kinds of conversations, and then trying to come back to the station and pivot back to, you know, reading the water announcements. So it was immense, and my hope out of all of that is that the next time one of these things happens, we have framework and we have infrastructure and we have a playbook for other teams who are put into this position.
Do y'all want to share really quickly?
Yeah, so in terms of like I have a couple of thoughts here. So like in terms of like self-care, a lot of us were taking on and getting trauma dumped on, and we were providing space for each other in that way, and then turning around and then providing space for each other on the leadership side of things in our teams. So it was like a domino effect of emotion and support in that way. And then it was like an outpouring of like volunteer support on the mental health aspect of things. I think we all kind of noticed like that aspect during COVID, where we realized that we have a lack of mental health support in so many ways. That was like such a traumatizing experience. I still keep hearing people talk about COVID. COVID's still ongoing too. You know what I mean? And like, so when we talk about it, it's like as it's in past tense, but it's not, it's still ongoing. But it affected us in such a way that like taught us like what is needed on the mental health aspect. So interestingly enough, like we saw a lot of volunteers step up and say that they would volunteer their time as like therapists and mental health support in that way. And so like that was a resource that was provided on AR's website. And but a lot of us like almost didn't even have time to do that because we were so focused on making sure that the information was getting out to the folks that needed it. We were calling each other in the middle, I mean like just odd hours, like, but definitely in the middle of the night, like 3 o'clock in the morning, like bawling our eyes out to each other based off of the information that, you know, someone else bawled their eyes out to us. And so you're carrying that emotional weight, you know what I mean? And then as you talk about it, it kind of balances it out, you know what I mean? You have to process it, and everybody goes about things differently and copes differently, you know? So we came up with a saying, touch grass, as like our self-care aspect. So touch grass, touch sky, breathe grass, breathe sky, you know what I mean? We were trying to be silly about it and comical about it to, you know, have that humor aspect. And then we tried to like come up with I guess like implement something positive, kind of like what you were talking about too. So like every channel, like most of our communication was back end on Discord, and so we had a channel created for something joyful or something off topic, and so like everybody would post like silly memes in there. So much of us are like remote working, so and volunteering, so like we were trying to make sure that there was a balance to the emotional like aspects. So you're dealing with this traumatic thing, and then but in order to keep going and keep doing what we're doing is like you have to balance it with something positive. So like we were trying to implement that as well.
Sí, de mi parte, un poco lo que estaba diciendo Laura sobre cómo como periodistas en un momento así, lo que a mí me pasó específicamente es que sentía que tenía que estar todo el tiempo trabajando, así que durante las primeras semanas creo que no hubo un momento en que pensé tengo que cuidarme a mí misma o tengo que pensar un poco en descansar o algo, y sí me pasaba de volver a mi casa muy tarde y está mi marido y mis hijastros ahí, y ellos me contaban su día, y su día había sido tratar de conseguir agua, pensar que dónde conseguir comida, y eso era lo que me devolvía un poco a la realidad, pero era una realidad que también me estaba afectando, así que era muy difícil tomarse un momento para self-care, y realmente creo que en gran parte muchos todavía seguimos así, sabiendo que todas estas historias todavía está pasando, todavía hay muchísimo para contar sobre cómo la comunidad sigue sufriendo el impacto del huracán, sobre todo en mi caso la comunidad latina, que es una comunidad desatendida, es una comunidad que en gran parte indocumentada. En la zona donde nosotros vivimos es una comunidad que hoy está enfrentando también el ataque de un gobierno completamente dirigido hacia ellos, hacia la comunidad migrante, hacia nosotros. Entonces, para mí era ir y ver todas esas historias y estar con personas en comunidades donde no están en el centro de Asheville, no están en lugares quizás más conocidos de la zona de las montañas, viven en zonas inundables, viven en parqueaderos de casas móviles, viven en lugares donde la ayuda llegó muchísimo después que en otros lugares, y donde hoy todavía voy a reportear a esas comunidades y sigue básicamente todo igual que el 27 de septiembre de 2024. Entonces, cuando vuelvo al self-care, quizás es darse cuenta como periodista que no podés hacer todo el trabajo. Solo hay que tener un punto de vista y poder contar la historia que podés contar y darte cuenta que esto va a seguir durante muchísimo tiempo. Así que en ese primer tiempo lo mío fue tratar de decir, yo sé que la radio pública con Laura están llevando la información que necesitaban todos saber, y nosotros como periodismo en español para la comunidad latina estamos tratando de tener un punto de vista de contar las historias que nos estaban contando en ese momento. No sé si eso responde a la pregunta del self-care, pero en realidad el self-care era tratar de darme cuenta que soy una persona tratando de llenar un lag en lo que es el periodismo, que era el periodismo en español, y bueno, y podía hacer lo que podía hacer en ese momento.
Oh, it's okay. As a journalist, está bien. It's okay. It's an emotional topic. So, at that time, as a journalist, so I was thinking that I had to work all the time. So the first weeks, I don't think I even thought about taking care of myself, even sleeping or resting. I would go back home very late. My husband and my stepsons were there, and they were talking about finding water or things like that. And that brought me back to my reality. But still, my reality was very tough. So I don't think I got the time to, at that moment, take a minute for myself. Many of us are still living that life. We're still there because this is a situation that continues, and the community is still impacted by the hurricane. And in particular, in my case, it has to do with the Latino community, because there is a lack of assistance, and they are not very well taken care of. And right now we are suffering the attack of an administration that is directly targeting the migrating community, and these communities are not usually located in the center, downtown Asheville, or even in the most well-known areas in the mountains. They are in more remote areas or in trailer parks, and the aid got there much later. So in some places they are still living that very same 27th of September 2024. So as journalists, we must know that we cannot do it on our own. And I knew, for instance, that Laura was broadcasting information to a particular part of the community. So I thought that as a journalist, I had to fill in the gaps. For instance, in the case of the Spanish journalism, or the journalism for people that speaks Spanish. I don't know if this answers the question about self-care, but I think it still is very important for me as a person to be able to fill that gap for other people.
There's so much that each of our panelists can talk about. We have so much more to share, but we only have a few minutes left. Each of you have mentioned just this need for resources and support. Laura, you were mentioning this playbook. Like, what kind of playbook could we have in place for future disasters? Because they're happening. They're happening now. And I want to open up for a couple of audience comments and questions too. So could each of you, from your own perspectives, just maybe name a couple things that you would put in that playbook, that you think we need to have there? Let's start with Patricia and come down this way.
Okay. Sí, ¿qué cosas necesitaríamos tener en cuenta para un próximo desastre, o qué cosas aprendimos? Creo que fue fundamental la colaboración entre medios, el hecho de que BPR, de Public Radio abriera las puertas a los periodistas para que pudiéramos trabajar ahí. Y no solamente eso, sino que empezáramos a colaborar y a tener información en español en la radio. Creo que ese tipo de colaboraciones entre medios en español y medios en inglés se puedan realizar más a menudo, que puedan seguir continuando más allá de un desastre, es muy importante para la próxima vez que nos pase y también para todo el tiempo, porque la información en español se necesita todo el tiempo, no solamente cuando pasa algo como el huracán Helene. Entonces, para mí, como medio, creo que la gran oportunidad sería poder tener más fondos, más colaboradores en español en mi zona y seguir contando con el apoyo de quienes nos apoyaron y nos siguen apoyando.
So what would we need, or what are the lessons learned for subsequent situations such as this one? Well, first, I think it was great that PPR, or public radio, opened its doors for all of us, and I think that it was great to have such collaboration between Spanish speakers and English speakers that were engaged in conveying information in the radio. But I do think that this has to happen more frequently or even constantly, not only when we are going through disasters such as the Hurricane Helene. So I think that we also need more funding, but in particular, we need an increasing collaboration among Spanish and English speaking professionals.
The phases of relief, there's three. There's the first phase, the second phase, and the third phase. And what we noticed with disaster relief with Helene is that that's in the process of changing in real time because of the work that we've all done. And a lot of us, when I say us, I mean like Appalachia Relief, everyone within that volunteered there, that worked there, and then all of the collaboration that happened with all of the other organizations and grassroots. So when I say us, I mean that. A lot of us are talking about this playbook as understanding that we're changing the phases of relief right now, and what does that look like, and how do we lean into it in an accessible way, in a way that is going to help people and be more efficient. And so like we're in a lot of different spaces that are facilitating these conversations, and I'm kind of excited to see like what comes of it. Like it's work that needs to be done, and something that I've learned in the last 6-7 months, even like pre-Helene, is I had an assumption on how change can occur, and there's a unique opportunity for disaster relief to implement real systemic change. Because you're rebuilding and recovery in a sustainable way, and you're thinking about the environment and thinking about how to rebuild in a way that it's stronger. And so there's this really unique, beautiful opportunity, this silver lining that's coming from this. And I just feel kind of like honored to be in these spaces to have these conversations, because it's why I went to school and got my degree. I've fought to do that as a disabled person myself, as someone who was late diagnosed autistic. Like everything is set up against me. It's all set up for me to fail. So like I am here to like hopefully make it so that way no one else experiences the fight the way that I had to experience it. You know what I mean? And so like being able to have this opportunity to change something and how it functions, so that people don't die of hypothermia, like, that's insane. It's mind-blowing and overwhelming, but like it's also like this great honor that like I get to explore my passion in this way. And it's not like people aren't just functioning in just one area. Like we're representative of folks that are working remotely and volunteering remotely, like all over the place. I work closely with someone in Canada. I work closely with someone in California. Like everyone is collaborating and pushing this forward to change how disaster relief is. And so maybe by next year I'll have like some concrete, like this is what we're doing to show.
Micah, you're so inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Or
I don't want to follow
just
that. And no, I think about it much more, in I'll just speak in practical, like tactical terms for a newsroom, which is some of the stuff I already talked about, right? Like you have to have a plan for basic needs. I had a plan. I had an emergency plan. I was very smug. I had an emergency plan that I made to address gun violence because I thought that would be the emergency we would be dealing with. If you'd asked me to list the emergencies I thought we'd be dealing with, a hurricane in Western North Carolina would have been very low on that list. So some of it is, and we were so fortunate, people from all over the country at other public media stations reaching out to say, hey, we've been through similar with fires, we've been through similar with earthquake, whatever the natural disaster there is, you can do this. It is possible, but I think there's a need for that shared knowledge and shared information, documentation, because when you work those number of hours, your brain, I mean, if it wasn't written, we had something we called the big doc. If it wasn't in the big doc, like it didn't exist. So I think some of it is just, sort of creating some structures that allow people, when these things happen, kind of plug in. And I will say, I just wanted to give you a shout out. Shannan is we call her the fairy godmother of journalism, because there's so many needs you're not going to anticipate. Like one of my reporters was struggling one day and said, I just need someone to walk my dog. And I'm like, hey, Shannan, could you get us somebody to walk a dog? So, having partners who helped us develop the Blue Lena, and Shannan helped us, and Mel Kramer helped us get the text-only version of the website, similar to what we were talking about earlier. So it's those kinds of things, but like having an opportunity to think through those kinds of things in advance, document those things, and have a game plan, because again, this is not, we treat it like an anomaly, and unfortunately it's not.
Can I add one thing really quick? On top of that structure, a website was created for supply hubs to be able to balance their supplies, so that's something that's also changing the phases of relief, and and was also deployed in the LA wildfires, and is currently being deployed for the current floods that happened last week. Yeah. And so that's kind of goes hand in hand with that, and I wanted to mention that real quick. That's ran by R4, which is the nonprofit that fiscally sponsors Appalachia Relief, and so that is going to continue, and that is going to grow and change too, but I just wanted to throw that out there too.
I know that we are at time, but I also wanted to say, I know we have a question from, you want to ask? You can. But I do want to say that something else in the playbook that I think all of you have shared is funding. And I want to turn real quickly to put one person on the spot, just because I think there have been some people who have been inspired by what everyone is doing, and also I think everyone's learning about the need to prepare for disasters and the need to prepare communities to have better communication infrastructure and to equip journalists to be able to be that lifeline during these times. Casey, could you share just really quickly, based on what you've been inspired to do?
Yeah, thank you, Shannan, and thank you all. God, talk about it inspiring.
Say who you are,
and
please.
A little teary. Sorry, I'm Casey Palahniuk. I am with the Google News Initiative, and I oversee most of our U.S.-based programming and funding initiatives. And the way that I got involved is actually very random, and I don't know, Shannan, if I even told you the genesis of this. We historically fund a lot of things. We fund audience programs and ad programs, data, things like that. We do not fund disaster relief programs, with one exception, which was during COVID at the height of it. We managed to spin up a massive, infusion of funds into the global industry, where we just wrote checks to thousands of news organizations because it was that dire. But that was sort of seen as a one-off, all right, that was cool. And so when I'm thinking through the programming that I fund and support, disaster relief is not top of mind at all. But one of the benefits and downsides of working for a massive company is that we have a lot of executives, and things don't really move quickly all the time unless an executive gets involved. And in this case, one of our most senior executives in our C-suite had a tie to Western North Carolina. And I got added to an email very last minute, in sort of a couple days after the hurricane hit, saying, what are we doing in Western North Carolina to support news organizations? And my boss and I were like, well, what? Like, I guess something, but like not really anything. And they sent us Micah's document and said, this is incredible. Like, what are we doing to support these communities? And so very quickly, we were like, well, we can get, and so they then sent me, and we were like, again, we're not really doing anything, but we can look into it. Then they sent me Shannan's, the local North Carolina local news workshop, and they're like, these people know what they're doing. I was like, well, lucky for you, I know Shannan. And we had supported your conference, and we've known each other on the conference circuit and everything, but had never directly really worked together other than the North Carolina Local News and Information Summit. And I was like, well, good news, I have Shannan's phone number, and I'll just text her. And so that started, I think you were actually about to go on vacation or something, too. And you, like, dropped your vacation, and we managed to get a check written relatively fast for us to not necessarily support, which Jonathan's laughing because he knows how quickly we work, to not necessarily support the immediate disaster relief, but to support what comes next. And the playbook, the housing guide, all of that, recognizing that this will be continuing. Oh yeah, go on. What? And that it is.
I'm saying, like, we need funding.
Yeah. Like, this will be a thing. So that was meaningful. But what it really did, and what it opened up to us, and sort of allowing sort of to know your impact and moving forward to other communities, it allowed us to make the case to our executives that we need to do more disaster relief, and that this will just keep happening. And so we were able to work with Jonathan and INN almost immediately afterwards to say, all right, you guys have a really large network with INN. What can we do to support disaster relief in the country, knowing that this will keep happening? And it can't just be for nonprofit newsrooms, as great as they are. We need to make sure that this is for news organizations and reporters who are on the ground supporting the communities, but also living that trauma themselves. And so it came up faster than we expected, I think. We all got back from our holidays, and then the LA wildfires hit the next week. And so we hit the ground running and managed to get out with 28. We had 28 applications for independent news organizations in LA, 2 LA counties, and INN, God bless them, got out funding directly to those news organizations within like a 2-day turnaround. So that was an incredible impact that you've had downstream, and we literally met this morning about like what's next. So thank you for all the work that you've done, your leadership, and unfortunately for being the guinea pigs in many ways.
And thank you. And I know we're about to get kicked off the stage. There's so much more that we can share. Please come find us. If any of you want to hear even more, come to North Carolina, March 12th. We have our NC News and Information Summit. It's our 4th year doing this, and the keynote is going to be about Western North Carolina, featuring some of our panelists here today, moderated by Dean Baquet of the New York Times. We're going to keep talking about this, and thank you for the response efforts that many of you are already thinking about. Again, we're happy to share more, and thank you for the Night to the Night Foundation for having us here. This has been a really important conversation to have. Thank you.